You have to travel too.
Everybody right to go? You happy, Ollie?
Yep. All good?
That's right.
Okay, terrific. Thanks everyone for coming here today. It's always great to be in the Valley, but not in these circumstances, but it's important to see firsthand the extent of the damage and the support that we need to provide for local communities here in the Valley, but right across Victoria. It has been a week of wild weather. 125 kilometres an hour in terms of the wind. Mount Baw we saw 280 millimetres of rain. And right here we saw the flooding of the Traralgon Creek and an extraordinary rapid rise in the flooding over a very short period of time. So I'm here with the Acting Minister for Emergency Services, Danny Pearson, our Emergency Management Commissioner, Andrew Crisp, and we observed through the helicopter just the extent of the damage. And what was quite evident is whilst it's receding now, it still is quite deep in parts, and there's many areas that have been quite severely impacted. First and foremost, I want to thank everyone in this building, all of our Vic SES emergency personnel, all of our emergency services. You know, where would we be without them? They have done an extraordinary job in the most difficult of circumstances, many times highly dangerous. Evacuating people, rescuing people, and now as we head to the recovery period as well. So thank you to all of our SES colleagues, and through the regional control, if you can pass on my thanks. Everyone is doing an outstanding job. Thank you. So over the last week, we've had the immediate hardship assistance grants. This is providing, as the title suggests, immediate relief, food, clothing, shelter, hardship grants of up to $2,000 per family, around 586 per adult, and 560 per adult and 280 per child. But now we need to go to the next stage, and these are the usual disaster relief supports. This is jointly funded between the state government and the federal government, and I want to thank the Commonwealth for the speed in which they've engaged with the state so we can make the announcement of the emergency re-establishment assistance for households. So these are grants of up to $42,250, and it goes to a whole variety of things, whether it's support for accommodation, major repairs at home, repairing damage, re-establishing. We want to get people back in their homes as quickly as possible. So accommodation, repairs, purchasing items that have been lost in the floods. It's incredibly important, and people can go to the Relief Centre, which here is at the Traralgon Basketball Stadium, or go to the emergency.vic.gov.au website to access those grants. But I want to thank the Commonwealth. This is important support, and we're not over this yet. Whilst the flooding is receding and we are moving very quickly into relief and recovery, it's not over yet, and there may well be further rain later in the week. So pretty mild conditions for the next few days, but the possibility of rain in coming days as well, which we need to prepare for as best we can. I might hand over to Danny Pearson, then we'll hear from Commissioner Crisp, and then happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you, Acting Premier. And look, these are really challenging times for these communities, but my simple message is that we will stand shoulder to shoulder with local communities to get you back on your feet. These are really difficult, challenging times. As the Acting Premier indicated, we saw firsthand from the chopper some of the damage, and we saw livestock that has been sought higher ground to try and escape from the floodwaters. Over the coming days, we'll get a deeper appreciation for the level of damage, but we'll be working with local councils, we'll be working with local communities to give them the support that they need to get back on their feet. As the Acting Premier has advised, we are pleased that the Commonwealth have joined us to provide this necessary funding support, both in relation to personal hardship assistance grants, as well as the emergency re-establishment grants as well. These are really important steps because we want to make sure that the community has got the support that it needs to get out of this. But as the Acting Premier said, we are not out of this yet. You know, we have got an expected low that will hit Victoria later in the week, so we've got to watch this very carefully. Obviously, as the floodwaters start to recede, we'll develop a deeper appreciation for the level of damage that has been sustained by the communities. But my message to the Valley is clear and simple, and to the broader impacted communities. We are with you in this, we stand with you, we're going to work with you as you get back on your feet. Thank you.
Thanks, Minister, Acting Premier Andrew Crisp, Emergency Management Commissioner. It is always a pleasure to be down in the Latrobe Valley and here in Traralgon. Visited here a number of times during the 2019-20 fires. But again, we've gone from one emergency to another emergency that's had an impact on community and had an impact on people, on families, and our thoughts are certainly with those people and those families that have been impacted by this particular flood event. And our thoughts also with the families and friends of the two people that have lost their lives, one not far from here in Woodside and one in the west of the state. Also, thanks to our emergency services, in particular the SES as the control agency, an incredible job that they've continued to do through this particular emergency, but well supported by all our other emergency services and government departments. So an incredible effort. And again, there's a very much a personal side to that also. The fact that on that Wednesday night, you know, when those winds were howling, those trees were coming down, and we were seeing the rainfall that we saw. We know there were two SES members that were injured, that went to hospital. Good news is that they're both home now, but one sustained, you know, a broken shoulder blade, a broken wrist, and it could have been a whole lot worse. So there is a very personal side to it for our emergency services as well. In terms of where we are at the moment, so we have what we're calling riverine flooding. So where we've seen this significant rainfall the Premier's referred to, it's now in our river systems. So the threat in relation to flash flooding has dissipated, but we've got a lot of water around, and we saw that as we flew over the Latrobe and the Thomson rivers just a little while ago. So we do have warnings out. We've got warnings for the Thomson River for moderate flooding, for the Latrobe River for moderate flooding, and also for the Yarra River. So Yarra Glen, where it peaked about 24 hours ago. So there are still warnings out, and our message is still very much to the community. There's a shared responsibility here, and I want to thank those many people that have heeded our advice, heeded our warnings, and done the right thing. But we still have more to go with this, so please, if you haven't downloaded that Vic Emergency app, make sure you've done that. And don't just rely on one source of information. So listen out to those emergency broadcasters and other ways of making sure you've got good information so you can make good decisions. This is all about a shared responsibility. We do have the potential for a further East Coast low developing later next week. The models are sort of divergent at the moment. There's not a lot of confidence, but there's every chance that we could see up to 50 mil East Gippsland and back into South and West Gippsland. So this isn't over yet. We've got to continue focusing on the potential risk to communities. But at the same time, there is so much work going on to get communities and families back to where they want to be, back to normal. So at one stage, we had more than 300,000 homes that were off power. This morning, that's down to about 39,000. A lot of good work. My thoughts are very much with the 39,000 still off power, and rest assured everything's being done to ensure that those people get back on power as soon as possible. Power has been a central part of this particular emergency because it's had the impact on telecommunications, on water supplies, and then linked to that is actually the work that we're doing, and some great work in clearing up as many roads as we can so people can access fixed power, so we get telecommunications up and running again. So there's very much a coordinated effort, whether that's at state level or with what we're seeing here at the Regional Control Centre and the Incident Control Centre in Traralgon. So again, a long way to go, but a lot of really good work happening at the moment. And now I'm sure we'll be happy to take any questions.
Commissioner, there were concerns that people wouldn't be able to dial 000. Is that still the case, and what's the solution there?
There are a number of communities that still don't have access to 000. We're going through a number of different ways of doing it. We're ensuring there's community meetings, so almost basically door knocking, so people can come to a community meeting, understand what their sources are for accessing other information. With those particular communities, they might be isolated in terms of some telecommunications, but they're not geographically isolated, so people can get in and out. So we're working, again, Red Cross doing an incredible job out on the ground, making sure we're getting messages out as we can. That number of communities that are unable to access 000 is significantly reducing every day, but we will continue. That's got to be a priority for us.
You mentioned that you were here not long ago for the bushfires. What was it like for you personally in that helicopter looking down at the environment below?
That's a really good question, and I must admit I was reflecting on being down here during the fires, and I was actually thinking about farmers, and I know during the fires that they talk about the loss of soil. A lot of people will go to their homes, but for them it's actually what then generates their business. But then when we were flying over here, I was looking and seeing how green it was and dams are filled, and that will in some respects be somewhat more positive for farmers. But then I think about the devastation at the same time, and we saw some cattle that were sort of isolated on an island, and again I was just sort of reflecting on the stock losses during the fires, and then the potential impact we're seeing here. Fortunately, at this stage, no reports of stock losses. However, we've got to wait for that water to recede. So, yeah, significant events that have impact on all parts of our community, both flood and fire.
Commissioner, there's been a lot of community anger about the Traralgon Creek evacuation notice. We know there were people getting plucked out of cars about 7 o'clock in the morning, and that order wasn't issued until 20 past 10 or thereabouts. Why was it so late?
I think it's really important to sort of step this back and step it through. So there was a great deal of confidence from the Bureau a number of days out in relation to the potential weather we might see in this part of the state. So at 1 p.m. on the Tuesday, so when you think about this event was overnight on the Wednesday, so an advice message went out on Tuesday afternoon at 1 p.m. A warning went out on the Wednesday at 6 p.m. So again, engaging with community, and there have been some door knocking done and other ways of engaging with community. At 4 a.m. On the Thursday morning, an emergency warning went out. So again, telling the community that they needed to take action. This shared responsibility piece. And as you're quite right, the emergency notice or the emergency warning went out after 10 o'clock the following morning. We know that there were people that were being rescued earlier on the Thursday morning, and that my briefing in relation to that was people that had driven into floodwater. And I don't know how many times we have to tell people that that's unsafe, and that's how people die. And so, whilst we had to divert resources to actually do that, it meant that there needed to be a focus on the evacuation itself. So there was a gap there, but when you think about from Tuesday through till the Thursday, there were a lot of warnings given to community. So it is important that we do focus on this. What we've actually seen, and the Acting Premier touched on this, we saw record rainfall. When we look at the graph in relation to how quickly the Traralgon Creek rose, it's virtually a vertical line. We have not seen that before. However, whilst there are a number of factors that have led into this, we will be sitting down and we will be looking at not just what happened here, but across the state as a whole in relation to warnings.
Acting Premier, can we?
Sure.
Thanks, Commissioner. In terms of this new announcement, the $42,000 funding, is that for residents or businesses or both?
It's for both, Andrew.
Residents.
Yeah. So this is so we've got the hardship grants, which is immediate funding, and then we've got this for residential homes, getting people back on their feet, back in their homes as quickly as possible. So that's up to $42,250. As Andrew said, there'll be an assessment in terms of stock losses, property damage. There'll be engagement with local councils across Victoria where we've seen the devastation of the last week. So if you step it through, you've got the immediate assistance, food, shelter, clothing. Now you've got the re-establishment grants for residential homes. And then the next step will be what is the broader assessment of damage, and that's with engagement with industry. Just talking to the regional controller just before the press conference, particularly focused, for example, on our dairy farmers in the valley. And there'll also be engagement with local council. So we, in the normal way, step through the support for disaster support.
So there are a lot of businesses, particularly on the outskirts of where we are now, that have, like many homes, been flooded. They can't open for the long weekend. Obviously, given the year, it's been disastrous for them. What kind of options are available for those people? And
that will be the assessment that will happen. So we've gone from the immediate response to the disaster, the evacuation, rescuing. Now we're into relief and recovery. As we see the floodwaters recede, then we get a better sense of what level of damage has occurred. We've got a bit of a sense looking down from the chopper today, but there'll be engagement with local council, engagement with industry, with individual businesses in terms of what damage they have sustained, and there'll be further supports that we'll provide, but in the usual way that we step it through, response to the disaster, immediate relief, and now we're stepping through to the residential grants.
Do we know yet how many properties have been damaged across the whole state by this storm event?
Not as yet, but I might hand over to Commissioner Crisp to talk about that.
Thank you. There's ongoing work, impact assessment across the major areas that have been impacted, and not just in relation to flood, but storm. So my latest advice is that those impact assessment teams have visited almost 600 properties, and there's about 140 that have been impacted in one way or another. But we'll continue to do that impact assessment work, and then working very closely with local government to make sure we marry up that information. And as Acting Premier said, local government is key and critical in terms of what we will now be doing in relation to relief and recovery.
Can I just ask one more question on the Traralgon Creek evacuation notice? Why wasn't text messages sent out for that evacuation notice?
Sorry, I missed the question.
There was no text messages sent out like you do in fires, with that information, and people were struggling to access the internet, so I'm just wondering why that wasn't done.
Yeah, look, we will look at that as part of a review of that particular incident. Thank you.
Acting Premier, can we ask you some questions on some other things?
Sure.
Thank you.
First one's easy. Crowds at the footy next week. People, how many? What are we looking at?
I've got no announcements today. I know people are very keen on the answer, and we want to get crowds back to whether it's AFL or netball, basketball, whatever sport, and theatre productions. We want to get crowds and attendances back at these events, and back to where we were just a few short weeks ago. There's engagement between public health, with the AFL and with other leagues and other industries in terms of when we can have crowds back. That'll be based on public health advice. I don't have any announcement or details for you today other than to say that engagement's going, and there's been good engagement between the AFL and public health, but we want to get crowds back as fast as we can, and the best way to do that is to drive this outbreak into the ground.
So feeling positive we might have some crowds next week?
Look, I don't want to give a false indication. What I will say, and what I've said a number of times throughout this outbreak, and when we announced the circuit breaker lockdown, then we announced a further week, then we announced easing of restrictions. My expectation, as I said a few days ago, my expectation is by later in the week, we'll be in a position to announce further easing of restrictions for regional Victoria and further easing of restrictions for metropolitan Melbourne. So that's my expectation. We've heard, as I'm sure you know, one additional case, primary close contact already in quarantine. That's a good thing. But we're not over this outbreak yet, and we've got to drive it into the ground. But my expectation is we will be in a position later in the week to announce a further easing of restrictions.
And pretty good news with the Premier, how relieved are you that Daniel Andrews is coming back to work?
I'm very pleased. It's great. It's great to get that news from Dan that he's got the all clear from the doctors that a couple more weeks of recovery and he'll be back on deck on the 28th of June, and I'll very happily hand him back the keys. And yeah, but it's great news. I'm sure I speak for all Victorians in that we're really pleased. Every Victorian who's had a severe back injury knows how long and painful the recovery is. It was a very serious injury, and it's just wonderful news that he's shortly back on deck.
And we saw he made a post on social media last night, but do you think there are any other legitimate questions that need to be asked about this fall, or to put the public at ease, or has that moved on now?
No, I do not. I think I've responded to this a number of times. I don't buy into bizarre conspiracy theorists, and I don't think anyone should.
Acting Premier, just on COVID restrictions for regional Victoria, there's obviously been no cases in this latest outbreak, but they're still at stage 2 of the opening up, which means things like theatre productions, entertainment, they've just all been canned, but there's actually been no cases. So can you explain to regional Victoria why that was necessary, given there's been no community transmission out in the region?
Yeah, every step we take, every setting that we have in place is based on public health advice. That's what got us through last year during the pandemic. It's what defeated the second wave. And it's what will get us through this latest outbreak, is following the advice of our public health experts. And this has been put to Professor Sutton, Professor Cheng a number of times, why we got the settings that we do, acknowledging the case in regional Victoria that we don't have those cases. But what we had at the beginning of this outbreak were exposure sites right across the state of Victoria, in regional Victoria and in metropolitan Melbourne. Many thousands of primary close contacts, and a variant of the disease, a variant that is 50% more infectious than what we were dealing with in 2020. So there was great concern that if we didn't have those settings in place in regional Victoria and metropolitan Melbourne, if we don't have the current setting in terms of the 25-kilometre limit to make sure that people are not moving from Melbourne, travelling from Melbourne into regional Victoria. This is all about keeping regional Victoria safe and keeping the virus out of regional Victoria. But my expectation is, as I said, that by later in the week, as we get towards the end of this current 7-day period, we'll be in a position where we can announce further easing for regional Victoria. Like every person in Victoria, I want to get back to the settings that we had a few weeks ago. But the only way through this pandemic is the successful rollout of the Commonwealth's vaccine program and purpose-built quarantine facilities for our highest risk individuals. That's the only way through it. Between now and then, we've got to follow the advice of public health.
Just in terms of your business support, people that are registered for GST, which is people that earn usually less than $75,000, aren't eligible for it. So what's available for those really small businesses?
Look, it's a good question, and when you look at previous periods of support, so business support is a responsibility of the state government, income support is a responsibility of the federal government. Previously, those individuals would have been picked up by JobKeeper. Now, we had a short period of time during this outbreak where the Commonwealth did agree with our call to step in and provide some income support, but it only applied to the area that is deemed by the Commonwealth as a hotspot. So I know that this is difficult for businesses, for communities, for families across Victoria. We're providing over $500 million of business support for this current outbreak. In terms of the decision of the Commonwealth not to provide that income support that impacts on the individuals that you're talking about, that was a decision of the Commonwealth.
In terms of people, the financial support for people affected by the floods, when can they expect to receive some of those funds?
In terms of the timing, I'm not sure, Commissioner Crisp, can you answer that question?
It's so with the FAP or the personal hardship payments, they're immediate. So because that's very much about getting money out to people here and there, because they basically haven't got anything. So at this stage, there's only been 7 payments in relation to those that particular opportunity for people. So it's immediate, and there's been 7 up to this point in time. The re-establishment grants have just been announced, and we'll work with local government through that.
What kind of help's being provided for people that are still in places where they are sort of restricted and they can't get out of their properties? What has been done to those people? currently?
So relief centres have been established. So Traralgon had a relief centre here. There's been drop-in centres from from Trentham to Emerald. So very much connected again with local government. We are somewhat used to emergencies, and so everything is sort of kicked in terms of how we support local communities, and those relief centres and these drop-in centres have been critical. They've been providing opportunities for people to charge their phones, have showers, up in Kinglake. So all of that is actually happening at the moment right across all our impacted areas.
Thank you so much.
Lovely.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.